JetBrains released a free version for non-commercial projects of Rider. I have been using Rider for a number of years and also Visual Studio, but to celebrate this release of a free version, I want to show you how you can use Rider as a Visual Studio user. So I'm going to compare the both, not in depth, but just enough to get you started using Rider. If you start up Visual Studio and Rider, you will see quite a similar experience with the dialog that is presented to you. In Visual Studio, you do have here your recently used file list or project list, to be quite specific, and the same goes for Rider as well. And Visual Studio does allow you to create a new project, so does Rider. And if you look at it, Visual Studio does offer you the option to directly clone a repository. Well, Rider does as well, but it uses a different term for it. Get from version control system, the more generic term for it. And so that you can actually clone and start working on a remote project. So if you compare the two, they're both quite the same. There is a small difference, however, if you start creating a new project. So if I create a new project and I will go for a Blazor template, so I will simply check for Blazor. And if I go for the Blazor web app, you will see the next option, so the more of a wizard-like structure in Visual Studio. If I would do the same in Rider, you will see quite a different experience. I will drag it in too. I have all the project types listed here. This one is the last one that I used. But if I go for a Blazor web app, you only will see the create button. Why is that? Well, Rider uses a vertical layout, a single page setup, to actually configure the entire project. So if you select a template and you're used to Visual Studio, don't hit the create button directly, because it will not set up the project the way you would love to. Do scroll down a bit before you hit the create button, because then the project can be created the way you as a developer want it. I will switch to full screen now, because running two IDEs next to each other will be very difficult to see. I have opened the same solution within Visual Studio and Rider. It's a demo solution that I created for a user group, and it's simply a static web app created in Blazor with an API backend. And let's compare the different IDEs to each other. Well, of course, this is probably your well-known Visual Studio, where we do have our solution located on the right-hand side. At least I know by default. I know a lot of developers have moved it to the left-hand side because they simply like it a bit more there. And you will see that there's our menu, and depending on your setting, you could of course have the tool window here, the toolbar window here as well. So if I go here and I simply say, well, I want to select the toolbox, and yes, I could go here for instance, the test, and say that I want the test explorer here as well. So you can get an interface. Just wait a bit until it's started, because then I do want to auto hide it. You do have an interface that's quite minimal. Well, if we switch to Rider, things will look a bit different, and I'll simply move to Rider. This is the same project loaded, solution loaded in Rider. And you will see there's a lot more usage of icons in this interface. Well, of course, there's my solution here, and I do have some extra options because Rider does support a lot of things. Well, of course, here's my Explorer. And one of the things that perhaps the easiest to compare, if you want in the Explorer, you do have here the option for solution, but I can easily switch to file system here as well. And it's simply a click of the mouse. And if I compare that to Visual Studio, yes, I could do that here, switch between solutions and available views, and I could go, if I wait a bit, I can go to the folder view, and yes, I can switch back by simply double clicking on the solution, but the process is a bit faster in Rider. Okay, if I go over the user interface for itself, you will see that there's no menu being displayed. Well, it's all stored in the hamburger menu, so if you hit the hamburger menu, then you will see all the different menu options available. Well, let's first go through the different views. There's of course my commit window. There's good integration with Git as well, so I can actually use Rider to work with Git. I don't have to do that myself. I do have an Azure Explorer if I want to, resource managers. I can get the structure of a file, which can be quite easy. So for instance, if I open up, well, let's say the weather razor and just give it some time, you will see that the structure is empty. Let's see if I do have a weather forecast. And here you will see in the structure pane that the different things that you will see within my class. And if you have a very large class, it can be quite easy to simply go through the structure of it. Well, if you hit the ellipsis button, you will see that there are a lot of more views that you can actually use. Well, I did use my to-do. Of course, if I simply flag a to-do, it will end up here. Visual Studio will allow you to do that as well. I do have my build output. I do have my NuGet working. You will see that everything is going. That's a logcat. I'm not going to show you that one. All kinds of services that I, for instance, have my Azure Lite emulator, my terminal, which is of course just the same as you have with Visual Studio, and just as with Visual Studio, I can choose between a number of terminals. I do have my problems that you will be noticed, and there is a specific Git history window which is in place. Some of these windows may not be visible for you, because if you want, you can actually open them up here that they will show. And if you go to the right hand side, you will see there are notifications, and the notifications are quite good to notice. One of the things that you probably will always get is the Microsoft Defender configuration. I always select automatically here, but that doesn't mean that it won't pop up on a regular basis. But Rider doesn't have the same integration as Visual Studio has, so it will pop up for the Rider configuration. If you go here to the AI assistant, this will not be visible within the default configuration, just as you can use GitHub Copilot even within Rider. There's a different AI assistant that is being produced by JetBrains. I have this one installed in this version of Rider, so you will see my AI assistant. Functional wise, they can do the same. There's my way to interact with a database. I'll come to that at a later time. There's my device manager. You will see that I use this system as well to build Android applications. I do a lot of MAUI work. And there's a device explorer, which I will simply leave out for the time being. What you can do up here is, of course, you can build the entire solution and you can run and debug it. And we'll come to that at a later time. So, yes, the original layout looks a bit different, but then again, the menu is quite self-explanatory. Let's dive a bit deeper in different menus. Well, of course, if you go to File menu, you will see all the things that you can do to work with files and work with solutions. Well, if you do the same and we go for Rider and I open up the hamburger menu, you will see quite the same things that are available here. You will see that there is a possibility for remote development, that you can actually develop on a remote machine. And of course you do have here the settings, and there are a lot of settings that you can use for Rider. I would advise you to start experimenting with it, but do know what you change because it's highly configurable. Okay, that's about the file menu. If I now go back to, for instance, the edit menu, you will see here that's this very small edit menu with an option to go to everything, find and replace, simply of course the copy, cut and delete options with some advanced things and bookmarking. Well, if we go to Rider and if we do the same, if we go to the edit menu, you will see almost the same things. So the undo, the redo, search, selection expanding, you will see some things that Visual Studio has got in different menus like toggle casing, join lines, and these are stored here in the edit menu. Okay. And let's go a bit further. You will see the view menu, and with the view menu in Visual Studio you will see all the different dialogues or toolboxes that you can actually open within Visual Studio. And you do have toolbars here, and you have the ability to go forward and backwards. And if you compare that a bit to Rider, you will see quite a different view menu, because it's a lot less big. And why isn't that? Because in my tools window in the submenu you will see all the different menus that I can start using. One of the cool things I like about Rider is the appearance menu within the view menu, because I do give a lot of presentations, and it's easy for me simply to enter presentation mode, and if I do that you will see that the font size actually starts increasing. Well, I'll simply exit it because it did come to my entire widescreen to go to presentation mode. But it's an easy way to actually work with different audiences, and you can imagine if you have to present some code to your coworker, it can be quite an easy way to do that as well. Well, you can use distraction free mode where you only will see the editor. You can go full screen with the Zen mode. So there are a lot of things that you can actually start doing, working with Rider if you have different means. Well, you do have the quick definitions. One of the things that Visual Studio doesn't have, which is sometimes quite handy, is the recent files. Which files did I go to in this solution recently, or even which have I recently changed? And then you will see that there's only one for recent changes, so that's not a very active solution, but it can be, especially in a large project, it can work out quite nicely if you can go to your recent files. And the same goes of course for recent locations and recent changes, and you can compare things, files with other files, but even with the clipboard. And it will allow you to quickly switch themes. So I could simply go, well, I want to switch to a different color theme. Don't use that quite that often because I don't switch normally that often between themes during the work. And if you have the active editor, if you want to enable wrapping, there's an easy way to do that here. And one thing that's easy, you can increase and decrease the font size in a central way through all editors. So if I simply were to do this, you will see that if I go to the view and I will increase the font size a bit. Well, I'm going to reset it because 13 points will probably be more than enough. Okay, and hide the device manager as well. Okay, let's go back. I did have the view menu. Here is my Git menu, and Rider does have the same. You do have the Git menu, but it's moved a bit. to the right, and you can see that you can actually do quite the same things with Rider as you can do with Visual Studio. One of the things that, for instance, here you have the GitHub integration. I can easily manage my remotes, for instance, and I can actually use multiple remotes if I want to. So quite the same options available in Rider compared to Visual Studio. If you go to Project, you will see different things like add new items, add class, project files, opening. Edit the project files is easy to do, for instance, in Rider as well. There's one thing that's not that easy, is working with COM in Rider. So you will see that Visual Studio, of course, has got its roots into the Windows development, where COM can actually still live. Rider is cross-platform. You can use the same version on Windows, Mac and Linux, and there's no COM on Mac and Linux. So there's connected services, startup projects, we'll come to that later on, and export templates, NuGet packages. Well, the NuGet packages we already saw, so if we go here, you will see actually that there is not really a project here. But the easy thing is, if I simply go here and I right-click the API, then it's easy to simply, with the add menu, to actually do add different types. And here it allows me to actually manage the NuGet packages as well. Okay, and you will see that there is a lot of information available within the pop-up menu, even to edit the CSPROI, or even put it in a write split mode, because you can actually switch it. Okay, that's about it about the project menu. Well, let's look at the build menu. The build menu here, of course, with the build, the rebuild, the clean solution, and the ability to do that for just one project. Well, we do have the same here. I can rebuild the solution, I can build and rebuild the project. And I do have some advanced build configurations where I can actually use diagnostics to be included, or to build it without dependencies. And that sometimes can come in handy if one of the dependencies has a bit of a problem, so that you can actually say, well, I want to build the current project and without updating the dependencies. Okay, great. So that's about the project window. Let's see what we can do. And the build menu, the debug, is a bit different in Rider, because you do have, of course, the profilers, stop debugging and things like that. Well, if I go here, I do have my run menu, and you will see that there are a lot of things that I can do to run and debug and stop and add breakpoints and toggle breakpoints. So there is quite the same things that you can set up for Visual Studio compared to Rider. And that's easy to get used to. Well, if I go to my test, of course, there's my test explorer, and I can use all kinds of things like running tests. Well, of course, Rider has the same. There is some tests. I do have a quick list. I can run and profile and cover all the tests from the solution. Well, this solution doesn't have any unit tests, so I can easily, I can't run them, but they do work, and it works quite nicely. Okay, if I go to Analyze, you will see there is some code cleanup. This is simply the version of Visual Studio that I show you is the Community Edition, so you will have some code analysis and active issues, but those are limited, of course. Well, Rider does support a lot more for that, so yes, I could simply run multiple profiling and work with code refactorings, and especially within code there is things like analyzing code, so that's easier to actually work with the code. And that covers it about the tools. Of course, there's some tools and presenter mode. I do use some plugins within Visual Studio, so things that you may not see. Extensions are covered as plugins within Rider. So if I go to my solution and if I go to settings, I do have here, and that's why I want to show you, you can actually easily search through all the things. So I can simply go through my plugins and I can see which one do I have installed and which are part of the marketplace. So I can actually look up, do I have any plugins that I really want to use? One of the plugins that I do advise you to use is that let's see if I can find it easily. Installed Japanese language, visual F#, there's a lot of things. Well, yeah, this is the one, Entity Framework Core UI. It comes bundled now. Make sure that you have that plugin installed, because that will make your life working with Entity Framework Core a lot easier. Okay, let's see. Well, Windows, not too specific, and help, you will see the help menu. Well, one of the things that the help menu in Rider also shows you is you will be able to find an action. And to be quite honest, I can also do that by simply hitting the left shift twice, and then it's easy to simply say, well, I want a certain action, I want to build something. So if you don't want to go through the entire menu structure, which I can really understand, you can simply browse through the actions and you can easily find them. Okay, one of the things that I do want to mention to you, because that's quite different compared to Visual Studio, Rider does keep the different versions separate on the disk. So that will mean that if you have a long history of using Rider, you will have some leftover IDEs, and there's an option here, delete leftover IDEs directory. Well, I simply say, well, view and delete. You will see that I have an old version of the 2024.1 version here, and that it does take up 2 gigs of disk space. So if you work a long time with Rider and you do install updates, don't forget to throw away the old leftover IDE storage directories, because it will take up quite some disk space. So if you run low on disk space, do look at this option to simply clean out the old versions that you no longer use. Okay, that's enough about the different menus. One of the things that there is no real comparison with in Visual Studio is the ability of Rider to actually perform refactorings. I don't know if you have used the Resharper plugin within Visual Studio. Well, it offered a lot of different refactorings, more advanced refactorings to Visual Studio. Well, those same refactorings are present in Rider out of the box. So if I go, for instance, to here the date, I do have here my refactor options, and you will see that there are a lot of more options to refactor compared to the default version, the community edition of Visual Studio. So that's why I sometimes use them both parallel, simply work with Visual Studio, and if I have to do some real refactorings, I'll simply switch back to Rider to do the refactorings for me. Okay, so that's very thing to keep in mind. If you really want to go with code refactorings, do use Rider for it, because it's much more powerful than Visual Studio. Debugging multiple solutions or multiple projects within the same solution is a bit different between Visual Studio and Rider. I, for instance, have set up this solution to work with multiple projects. So if I go to here and I say configure starter projects, Visual Studio will allow me to simply say, well, I want to have a single starter project or multiple starter projects. And that's about the best thing that you can actually do. Well, if you go back to Rider uses a bit more complex build setup, because if I right click here or I click here, you will see the client, and I do have the ability to actually edit configurations. And it does allow me to actually create launch settings and build setups for the different projects, but it will also allow me to actually add new configurations. As you can see, there are a lot of things that I can actually do to work with the build. And here, for instance, I do have the multi-launch, and I can say, well, I want to launch both API and web, and simply say, well, what configuration or task do I want to do? I want to add the API to it. And what do I want to do? I do want to add the client to it. And here I can specify if I don't want it to debug. And I can specify when I want it to launch. And one of the cool things is I can actually drag and change the order. Well, this would be a bit ludicrous to boot the client before the API. One of the things that I do want to compare between the two IDEs is how to work with databases. Yes, you can work with a database directly from within the IDE. I know that not a lot of Visual Studio users may use this option, but especially if you're working with a local DB, it can be quite easy to do it right within Visual Studio or within Rider without having to switch back to the SQL Server Enterprise Manager, because that isn't too nice a tool to work with anyway. Well, if I go to the View menu in Visual Studio and I go to SQL Server Object Explorer, and if I simply expand SQL Server, you will see that I do have two local DBs running. And if I expand the databases, you will see that I have two databases there, and it is automatically discovered. If I go to tables, you will see that the tables are listed here, and if I go to ASP.NET users, I can simply say, well, view data, and I will see the data. Well, if I want to do the same within Rider, things will get a bit more complicated, because yes, I can say, well, here I want to connect to a database. And yes, I do want to use a connection string, and I do want to use local DB, but then things get a bit nasty, because if I hit the drop down button, nothing happens. Rider does not discover the local DB instances running automatically. Well, an easy way to do that is if I go back to Visual Studio, I do have here my database, I do have here my properties, I do have here my connection string, and if I simply paste that one in, I can connect to the database, and it will then allow me to simply drop and check the DBO, check the tables, and go for my ASP.NET user. And in this case, it's called edit data, and then I can do quite the same. So once you can get the connection string up and running, they are quite as powerful between the two. Getting it to work is in Rider sometimes a bit more difficult. The last thing I want to compare between Visual Studio and Rider is the option to work together on the same source code. And work together, I really mean work together at the same time. So Visual Studio does have the option to start a collaboration session here, and so that you will have a live share option to work with a co-worker on the same code base at the same time. Well, Rider does support something quite similar, but this is still in beta. But that's called Code With Me. If I simply say, well, I do want to start a Code With Me session, then I can choose what kind of things would I love to do. just read only, edit files, full access. And for instance, if I say, well, edit files, and if I start a session, I do have to confirm. And then you will see that there is an option to actually copy a link and share it with the person, the coworker that I want to work with. So this works as well, just for Visual Studio and for Rider. It just is named a bit differently. Well, I hope this gives you a good foundation on how to work with Rider and to give it a try. There's one thing that I don't use Rider for, and that's working with the preview versions of .NET, because Rider is always lagging a bit behind compared to the previous versions of .NET. So if you really want to work with the latest and greatest preview versions, you are better off with the Visual Studio, the preview version, so that you can experiment with the new things. But if a framework becomes in production, Rider always provides a very fast and stable solution to work with the new version. So my advice would be simply give it a try. Just check if Rider will help you in your coding experience, and if it's not, both Visual Studio and Rider are some great products and you can use them next to each other. So it's always good to have a different tool in your tool belt, simply that you can actually work with it if it is handy for you. Well, hope to see you next time. Happy coding in between, and until next time.